I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Eosinophilic esophagitis is a progressive allergic disease characterized by difficulty swallowing and gastric reflux. It results from an elevated number of inflammatory immune cells in the walls of the esophagus. If left untreated, it can cause long-term complications, including scarring and difficulty swallowing. Revolo Biotherapeutics is developing a synthetic peptide therapy that has the potential to restore immune system homeostasis in EoE and other allergic diseases. We spoke to Woody Bryan, president and CEO of Revolo, about eosinophilic esophagitis, how the company's experimental therapy restores balance to the immune system, and how people who were exposed to tuberculosis pointed the way towards the experimental therapy. Woody, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity.
We're going to talk about eosinophilic esophagitis, Revolo, and its efforts to develop a therapy that can restore homeostasis to the immune system in people with the condition. Let's start with the condition itself, though. What is it?
Yeah, so you can think of eosinophilic esophagitis as a chronic condition, largely viewed as a chronic version of sort of food allergy that can be triggered by a number of different allergens where upon sort of exposure to the allergen, there is a cascade of inflammation into the esophagus that, if left untreated, can cause not only near-term but longer-term complications relative to food intake, esophageal health, and can lead to, in the most extreme cases, fibrostenosis in the esophagus, where you eventually lose the ability to take in solid food and have to go to a liquid diet and have to go to extreme measures such as esophageal dilation procedures.
I think it's easy for people to dismiss a condition like this when they hear allergies, think about a runny nose, but how does it manifest itself and progress?
Yeah, there's certainly an increasing awareness of the disease in the space. There's been, one or two approvals recently, and that always builds awareness, right? People start seeing in the public domain information about the disease. But basically the way it manifests itself is people often suffer from food impaction. We've all had episodes of trying to ingest certain types of food, maybe eating too quickly, maybe taking too large of a bite, maybe the consistency of the food, you feel like you have a blockage in the esophagus, and what do? You grab for a glass of water or the nearest liquid and wash it down. Imagine being in that situation where you're unable to dislodge whatever the food type is. It's dislodged in your esophagus. And that is oftentimes the first indication that you have something more than just a passing bout with trying to ingest solid food.
And how difficult is it for someone with the condition to get a correct diagnosis?
Well, it's a bit complex, right? You typically have to be referred to a gastroenterologist. The diagnosis occurs through really taking a esophageal biopsy, which is a quite invasive procedure, and then having a eosinophil count from biopsies taken from various locations in the esophagus. So it's not a readily diagnosed disease without having to go to a specialist and to go through a certain procedure.
And what treatment options exist today, and how effective are they?
Yeah, there's typically a stepwise progression. Oftentimes people, when they have an initial bout, will try to use proton pump inhibitors, which are really only sort of symptomatic. They aren't really getting to the root cause. They'll often then proceed to using steroids. Steroids have been used off-label for treating EOE for quite some time. They certainly have the ability to address some of the inflammation, but essentially no one wants to have to be on a chronic treatment regimen of steroids. There are all sorts of side effects and all sorts of longer-term complications. And so there's been a real push to look at, safer and more effective treatment alternatives. Now, I will say in the past few years, there is one steroid-based product that's been approved, and that's Eohilia. It's budesonide. It's an older steroid, but it's only approved for 12 weeks of use in treatment, when in fact, I'm not sure there's a real value to going down that road, because this is a chronic disease that if you stop taking your therapeutic, assuming you're getting benefit from that therapeutic, the disease state returns. The other approved product for some more severe cases is Dupixent. Dupixent was approved a few years ago. It's a monoclonal antibody. It is taken via subcutaneous administration on a weekly basis. And it is effective, quite effective for certain patients, but it's not without its contraindications. It's contraindicated for taking with anyone that's on a vaccine schedule. For younger patients, it is very expensive to use, and you have to use it chronically on a weekly basis. It's an annual whack of about $90,000. So getting insurance coverage and other aspects of being able to afford the medication are quite a hurdle. And then in time, there have been certain side effects that have come to the surface with the more chronic use of dupilumab, including things like conjunctivitis, and from an administration standpoint, there's quite a high level of injection site tolerability challenges associated with monoclonal antibodies in general.
You mentioned proton pump inhibitors, which I think of people using for acid indigestion, but do these have an anti-inflammatory effect?
They do not. So it's more of one of the manifestations and one of the symptoms of the disease early on is the fact that you have discomfort and you have dysphagia and you have a burning sensation in your esophagus. And early on in disease progression, it may give you some temporary relief, but it's not getting to the root cause.
You mentioned a range of medications, but I take it one way people have sought to treat this is also through diet. How effective an approach is that?
Well, it's a bit of a hit or miss, right? First of all, a lot of patients with EOE don't know exactly what their trigger is or what their allergen is that leads to the episode. In fact, it may be a combination of things. And so actually going through an initial phase of screening where you eliminate certain food types and are fortunate enough to land on identifying what your single or multiple triggers are is a real, sort of exercise unto itself. But if you're fortunate enough to identify it, then the ability to avoid those with your diet choices can be incredibly limiting. If it's driven by certain exposure to certain types of nuts or certain types of spice or what have you, as you probably can appreciate, it's difficult to find a lot of food choices that completely eliminate some of those types of ingredients.
This is also one of those conditions that I imagine are invisible to others. What's it like to have these daily living challenges with EOE?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly there are different levels of disease and severity of disease, but those that live with sort of moderate to severe disease, I actually met a gentleman I know that I actually play golf with occasionally, he was talking about recently that his son has been diagnosed with EOE, and he's had it for quite some time, and he actually had to go onto a liquid diet through most of his teenage years. And it's just miserable. I mean, you can imagine trying to navigate what do you fix, getting the proper nutrition if you're relegated to certain types of foods, or in an extreme case liquid diets, and the choices and the limitation of choices that you have, and just managing that on a day-to-day basis is incredibly complicated and time consuming, and it's quite the effort.
And do people with the condition generally have to carry EpiPens?
It's an interesting question. Not typically for EOE, but there are a fair number of people that actually have EOE that also have acute anaphylactic reaction to allergens from a food source. So it actually, to expand on that, there are numbers out there you can look and see that EOE is one indication that's a member of a group of diseases called Th2 diseases. It's reference to the type of immune response, if you will, and certain cytokines and other sort of chemistry involved in it. And basically about 2/3 of the patients that have a primary diagnosis of EOE have at least one other type 2 allergic disease, and the typical ones are asthma or atopic dermatitis. So there's a lot of overlap. If you have one Th2 allergic type disease, the odds of you having more than one is quite high, and that's a consideration as well.
What is happening at a biological level in a case of someone who has EOE? And is this considered an autoimmune condition, or is it responding to an antigen that's in the food?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you think about immunology in general, right, you have autoimmune diseases are typically a dysfunction of the immune system. That's an internal sort of issue. The inability of the immune system to sort of regulate on a normal basis and actually gets out of control. If you think about the allergic disease side of immunology, which is what we're talking about with 1104, it's driven by an external trigger, an allergen, like I said, an ingredient in a food. It may be peanuts, it may be some type of oil, it may be some sort of extract that's in some foods. But the pathophysiology and the biology is that anytime you have something and your immune system recognizes there's something coming into the body that's not supposed to be there or doesn't recognize, you set off a series of events, right? You have monocytes that typically and macrophages that identify the signal to dendritic cells, and dendritic cells really sort of tell this group of cells called undifferentiated T cells to become effector cells, like white blood cells that are meant to be increased in number to fight off the intruder, if you will, or to become Treg cells, which are natural T-type cells that regulate this inflammation process. The disease occurs when there's an overexpression and a runaway process, if you will, of generating too many T effector cells that cause inflammation and cause complications beyond the good that they were meant to bring to the process.
You mentioned 1104, which is Revolo's lead experimental therapy. What is 1104 and how does it work?
Yeah, so 1104 is actually a small peptide. It was discovered phenotypically, which means it was discovered through an observation through a meta-analysis of a certain group of individuals, if you will. So it was studied a number of years ago, an analysis of over 260,000 individuals that had been exposed to and had tuberculosis, and with MTB exposure. It was found that after their exposure to tuberculosis, they were actually 75% less likely to develop allergic disease, namely asthma or atopic dermatitis moving forward. And the question was, why is that? Well, there's an entity, a large protein that after you have TB resides in your lungs that goes undetected essentially for the rest of your life. And it was found that this large protein was actually in stealth mode and actually bringing therapeutic benefit. But that protein was not an entity that you could develop as a therapeutic. You couldn't manufacture it reproducibly. It had all sorts of complications around making it and making it reproducibly and testing it. So we actually do what you typically do in biology. We chop the protein up into linear peptide fragments and identified the fragment that was bringing the therapeutic benefit. And that is 1104. 1104 is manufactured by straight peptide synthesis. It's a peptide, but it has properties that lends itself to pharmaceutical development. We can deliver it through multiple routes of administration. It's proven to be incredibly safe in our clinical studies. And the way it works is, if you go back to me talking about there's sort of two legs to the immune cascade. There's the effector side, there's a regulatory side. And the therapies that are in the market today work on the effector side. So you have these sort of cytokine and chemokine signaling pathways like IL-4, 5, and 13 on the effector side that are expressed and upregulated when you have this sort of allergic event. And current therapies are meant to shut those pathways down. They shut down one of them or two of them, but they're very narrowly focused in shutting down part of this inflammatory cascade. 1104 works very differently. It works actually very much upstream, that when this allergen is introduced, it proactively changes the way these macrophages and dendritic cells inform the immune system to basically not overreact from an effector inflammatory side, and to, again, activate these Tregs and Bregs that are naturally designed in the body to regulate the inflammatory process. So in being upstream, we're able to affect a broader base of the inflammation, but to also bring a natural T regulatory and B regulatory element to the reaction to the allergen that other therapies are not able to do.
It was interesting to hear you tell the story of the discovery of this, which was so fascinating. But the fact that it's a peptide, you mentioned you could deliver it in various ways. You are looking at both subcutaneous injections and delivering it sublingually, which I imagine offers certain advantages over a monoclonal antibody like Dupixent. But what's the plan for exploring those, and what is the significance of that from a patient point of view?
It's huge. When you think peptide, you typically, in any sort of what I call larger molecule that has amino acids and has a fairly larger structure, you think about limitations on the ability to deliver it. You typically would think this has to be an intravenous injection, which is the first generation dosage form we've used for 1104 in the clinic. But we now have developed data, and we are developing and shown that we can deliver 1104 subcutaneously. And also we have shown in a tried and true animal model that we're able to impressively deliver it sublingually. So we have the option going forward to deliver it by subcutaneous or sublingual. If you break that down from a patient standpoint, currently treatments in the EoE space, you have Dupixent that is out there that's a monoclonal. It is not amenable to oral delivery, and it is relegated to weekly injection subcutaneously. So we have data that supports us actually being able to deliver subcutaneously, but dosing probably every 2 weeks and maybe even less frequent than that. So in the EoE category, and certainly against steroids that are oral but have a safety issue, we believe a sub-Q can certainly be competitive. Now, if you look at sublingual in that space, again, we have a short half-life but a long pharmacodynamic effect, which means we don't have to dose every day. So we have data suggests we can dose sublingually and possibly dose it once weekly or once every 2 weeks with a single oral administration. That would even be more competitive in EOE. And the same holds true in the atopic derm space, where you have monoclonals being dosed every 2 weeks subcutaneously, and things like the JAK inhibitors and steroids that are dosed daily orally, but they have serious safety concerns.
What's known about the safety and efficacy of 1104 from studies you've done to date?
So we've actually done 5 studies in human subjects. That includes our EOE study, an allergen sensitivity study, which is in patients that are grass pollen sufferers, and then multiple other studies that are in healthy volunteers that are part of the development process. So in total, we've dosed over 150 human subjects, and we've had no serious adverse events. We've had no patients in those studies withdraw because of any drug-related tolerability issues. We've also completed what is required by the FDA, in addition to the healthy volunteer sort of dose ranging work. You have to do a longer-term chronic multi-species tox program, and we've done that for our IV and now also additional work for our sub-Q, and we've seen no adverse events associated with administration of 1104. Very safe, gives us a very wide safety margin, and in the end, as we continue to do larger studies and longer studies, we believe it could be, along with efficacy and route of administration, it could be one element of a highly differentiated product profile.
And what's the development path forward?
Yeah, so as we've referred to a few times, we've completed a small phase 2 EOE study using our IV administration. Our next top priority is to conduct a phase 2B EOE study using our subcutaneous administration. And then we also are planning and moving forward to be prepared to conduct a phase 2 study in atopic dermatitis.
You mentioned the various ongoing clinical studies, but how broadly are you thinking about the potential for this?
Well, yeah, the natural progression, if you start with EOE, right, aside from EOE, there are neighboring eosinophil-related gastrointestinal diseases, which they call collectively the EGIDs, but it includes EOE, and as you traverse down the GI tract, you have EOG and EOD. And if you look at total prevalence there, the latest number suggests that EOE has a U.S. prevalence of greater than 500,000. There are recent studies that say that the EGID family in general is 2 million or more and growing. Atopic derm, I mentioned, we have a strong preclinical package, and mechanistically it makes sense that considering lung diseases like asthma and others, maybe COPD, is certainly warranted. And then you get into things like chronic urticaria, and then on the acute food allergy side, we have some preclinical data that's quite interesting. So all of those are quite large markets. Atopic derm in particular is 12 to 15 million U.S. prevalence and growing rapidly, as I mentioned, EOE and chronic urticaria. So there are a number of different directions that we can go with the program.
Revolo is privately held. It completed a $53.4 million Series B in 2020. How far will existing cash take you?
Yes, we raised a Series B in fall of 2020, and then we did a subsequent Series C, and we now have launched into a fundraising on the heels of the EOE and atopic derm. The allergen sensitivity EOE and the atopic derm preclinical data, and our news on sub-Q and sublingual. we are in a fundraising round for a Series D, and in parallel, we are actively engaged speaking with potential partners to help us take these programs forward.
And have you said how large a round you're hoping the D round to be?
Yeah, so, there are a number of things we can do. In an ideal scenario, we want to do the larger phase 2B EOE study, and we'd like to also complete the phase 2 atopic derm study, and in doing so, bring these other routes of administration, particularly sub-Q and sublingual advance. So to accomplish all of those and be covered by the round, we're raising in the neighborhood of $60 million. But that's our ultimate goal. There are ways to size it appropriately and move into the clinic, but that's the raise that we are focused on to be able to do the things that we want to prioritize moving forward.
You have a sort of pipeline and a product here and some ambitions for getting it as broadly indicated as possible. How has the funding environment affected your development plans? Have you slowed down advancing candidates or narrowed your focus in any way or limited your hiring because of that?
Yeah, well, listen, when we built the company, we built it to be quite lean. We have less than 20 full-time employees. We lean heavily on consultants. So we're very capitally efficient. Certainly the private market, as far as funding private companies has been challenging. We've been very fortunate that we have very supportive existing investors that allow us to continue to move forward on certain fronts, but we do need to either expand our syndicate and bring in additional investors alongside our existing investors, and or in combination with some sort of partnership to be able to go forth and fund the clinical studies that I mentioned. The spend becomes larger, right, by virtue of us having success in the clinic and moving on to later stage studies.
Woody Bryan, President and CEO of Revolo Biotherapeutics. Woody, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.